Welcome everyone to the second webinar in our five-part series on the emerging field of business data ethics. My name is Dennis Hirsch, and I am the faculty director of the Program on Data and Governance, which is a program of the Moritz College of Law and of the Translational Data Analytics Institute at The Ohio State University. The Program on Data and Governance, or PDG as we call it, focuses on the governance of advanced analytics and AI so as to achieve their many benefits while reducing or preventing the harms that they can create. This webinar series on business data ethics examines how companies are governing their use of advanced analytics and AI towards this end. We're very glad that you have joined us today to hear leading thinkers and practitioners talk about this important area. Please see the agenda for our remaining webinars on business data ethics, one each week for the rest of the month of October. As I mentioned, PDG is a program of the Moritz College of Law and of the Translational Data Analytics Institute at Ohio State. And we are delighted today to be joined by Professor Tanya Berger-Wolf, the faculty director of the Translational Data Analytics Institute. And I'd like to invite Tanya to say a few words and tell you about the important work that TDAI is doing. Tanya?
Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to co-host this wonderful series of events on business data ethics. Translational data analytics at The Ohio State University is the largest the largest interdisciplinary institute at the university. And it is the hub of everything data. We have more than 200 affiliates spanning all 15 colleges of the university, and we're focused on research, educational, data services, and community building activities, including internally and externally with business, government, and community partners. With data being the center and nexus of everything, from very esoteric issues to everything that touches our society today, the aspects of policymaking, law, governance, ethics, societal norms that are affected, fairness, transparency, accountability of data critical decisions and data enabled decisions are coming to the center of the conversation in data science, artificial intelligence, and data analytics solutions. And it is because of that translational data analytics not only started an explicit community of practice around responsible data science, of which this is an example event, we also started initiatives in responsible and just data science in research, education, and translational activities that go beyond the Ohio State University community. And I'm delighted to co-host and co-sponsor this wonderful event and the whole month of events on business data analytics. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor Berger-Wolf and TDAI for your support of the Program on Data and Governance. My name is Piers Turner. I'm the director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values and a member of the philosophy department here at Ohio State. And I'll be moderating today's panel on substantive data ethics frameworks and policies. This panel is part of a series on business data ethics tied to the release of a report by a research team here at Ohio State, led by Professor Dennis Hirsch, who you met earlier, who's at the Moritz College of Law. The impetus for that study was the growing awareness by many companies that privacy law simply does not address all of the ethical concerns arising with new uses of advanced analytics and AI, And they need to go beyond legal compliance to thoughtfully engage data ethics. In interviewing privacy and data ethics managers, we learned in that study that data ethics management programs generally consist of three components: substantive benchmarks for drawing lines between ethical and unethical projects, management processes for achieving these substantive goals, and technological solutions. Today's panel will focus on the substantive benchmarks. I'm sure there will be some bleeding into other topics, but as much as possible, we want to stay on the substantive benchmarks question. And later webinars in this series this month will address management approaches and technological solutions. So with respect to the substantive line drawing, our interviews of chief privacy officers, data ethics officers, and others often found them expressing the desire to, quote unquote, do the right thing. They sensed that their company's reputations will depend on their ability to draw a line between ethical and unethical data use, and to have responsible decision procedures to stay on the ethical side of that line. But what are the main ethical harms that they are worrying about? And what principles are guiding their thinking? And how do they think about the responsibilities of their companies to society with respect to data ethics? To discuss these questions, we're lucky to welcome a distinguished panel of experts who are practitioners in the world of business data ethics. These include, and you can see them now, Alonzo Barber, Assistant General Counsel at Microsoft; Peter Cullen, Privacy Innovation Strategist at PwC; Jeremy Greenberg, Policy Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum; and Mike Hinsey, Partner at Hinsey Law. All of them have long track records now of sort of thinking about these issues as long as this space has been around. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So let's start with Jeremy. Jeremy, I know you've studied the substantive frameworks that various associations and companies and academics have developed to provide some guiding principles for business data ethics. So how would you characterize those efforts?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierce, and thank you to Dennis and Professor Tanya Berger-Wolf and all of those who organized this event. Thanks for having me. So yes, we're seeing ethical principles and guidelines and frameworks related to AI governance and ethics, emerging technology from a number of different stakeholders. And as you brought up, Pierce, all of these principles or guidelines, they share this broad common goal of doing the right thing when it comes to AI governance. Now, each of these stakeholders and frameworks, they have their own definition of what doing the right thing means, their own interests and ideas about how to get there. But it's really important to note, I think, that we have this shared broad goal among all of these stakeholders of doing the right thing with this emerging technology, with data. So who are the stakeholders at play here? First, we have the companies who design or provide this technology. And essentially, we have all of the big players in this space, the major tech companies in this space, releasing these principles. So, for example, we have Microsoft, who are represented today on this panel, companies like Intel, Facebook, Google, they're all releasing these sets of principles. And the goals of these principles are often twofold. The first, we have this set of principles with benchmarks for their internal teams, whether that's policy folks, engineers, marketers, legal team, to follow when designing or distributing these systems. A second goal here is accountability, to release something in the public to obtain or gather consumer trust in what these companies are doing with this technology, and a way to inform consumers about what's happening. And also, you have these big tech companies putting out these principles, these benchmarks. This has a real influence on just the broader conversation of AI, ethical issues, and just emerging technology issues in general. So we have companies releasing their principles. We're also seeing a number of principles released by governments, agencies, international groups from all over the globe. And these frameworks often represent broader national or international strategy around these technologies. So one of the most prominent examples we've seen recently, the EU's high-level expert working group, they've released a draft ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. And here you're seeing a lot of kind of the benchmarks you're seeing from companies expressed by these governments. So ideas like preventing harm, fairness, accessibility, inclusivity, respect for human autonomy, and then a lot of more kind of traditional privacy concerns like control over data, consent, notice. So we're seeing a lot of these same principles sort of across different stakeholders. We're also seeing a number of principles from civil society and academia, and these often look to influence advocacy around this technology. A prominent example, Access Now has done a lot of work in this area. And they're really one of the groups leading the charge in thinking about human rights and how benchmarks involving human rights can really influence this debate. So here they're taking, new technology. We have a lot of questions. This is a new world, a new landscape, but it's being mapped to this well-developed body of human rights law. So we have, that's a major trend we're seeing. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of principles and guidance released by diverse stakeholders. I would say a big trend we're seeing is coupling of the more traditional notions of privacy that we think of. So notice, transparency, control over data. But we're seeing that coupled with these other privacy plus or adjacent concepts like fairness, bias, human rights, public safety. So there's definitely a recognition today that these more traditional privacy notions link up with these other ethical concerns. So these guidelines really are taking a more sort of fulsome approach now when looking at this technology. So that's just a bit of an introduction into the landscape and some of the benchmarks we're seeing.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's really helpful. And part of what you're saying is that there isn't really yet a coalescing around just like one set of these guidelines, which I think nicely then sets up Alonso, who is coming to us from Microsoft. And Alonso, I'm curious what you think about Jeremy's comments, because Microsoft, as he mentioned, has developed its own substantive framework of principles and guidelines, including fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. And so I'm sort of curious what you can tell us about maybe how you landed on those principles and just how you're putting them to work at Microsoft.
Sure. Thank you for the lead in, Pierce. And I want to start off by thanking Dennis, Professor Berger Wolf, and the rest of the Ohio State University team for putting on this amazing event, and happy to be a part of it. So you're absolutely right that as far as the way to go in this day and age, particularly around AI and ethics, is really to sort of have a principle-based approach. And Microsoft obviously has its principles, as you alluded to, but I really think the true thing is about how do you sort of operationalize or live by those principles, so to speak. And we have a history in the company of doing that with respect to topics around cybersecurity or privacy, sort of how we sort of bake in and continue to have the those principles or those philosophies really just become a part of the development process of our products and services. So therefore, you always know that your whatever your offerings are to either consumers or to commercial customers, that you can feel rest assured that those principles are always sort of embedded, and you're doing particularly the right thing with respect to that particular area of technology. Now, when it comes to the concept of AI and data ethics, we do have an approach to how we sort of operationalize those with respect to the company. And those really happened in two ways. We've established the Office of Responsible AI. And also, and on top of that, we also established what is called the AI Ethics and Effects in Engineering and Research Committee, or AETHR Committee. It's a mouthful, so AETHR Committee. And I'll talk a little bit about both those and how we sort of think about the applicability of those sort of organizations and processes and sort of, again, operationalizing our AI principles to come into realization. With respect to the Office of Responsible AI, what really it kind of, you think about their charge is really sort of in fourfold. The first is sort of to set internal policies and principles. We talked about, obviously you alluded to, Pierce, the enumeration of those principles. Those really are sort of governed by kind of, and as they may evolve, change, or how we sort of think about those, internally, the Office of Responsible AI is sort of responsible for defining those, and as well as internal policies. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. Another thing is to do that the Office of Responsible AI is really about ensuring readiness. That requires the internal training to make sure that we as employees, or we as folks that are representing the company in various facets, really truly understand and internalize what those principles are and how we sort of have those conversations externally. And of course, not all of us can be subject matter experts in this area. So one of the things that the office has also done is establish sort of what we call AI champs. So those really, deeply embedded, deeply knowledgeable subject matter experts that are sort of available to us at our disposal if there's a question or a concern or some sort of issue that we need help working through, really tapping into those resources to help our readiness and understanding to make sure we're having conversations and moving along in the right path. Another aspect of the Office of Responsible AI is case management and triage, to really basically, as those issues may come up, there are maybe operational or internal concerns and considerations that need to be sort of triaged, managed accordingly, because not every sort of use case is the same, though that would be sort of the single point of contact or single sort of source to be able to sort of triage those issues. And then not only from the internal policies and procedures aspect, but actually the external, the public policy, engaging with government officials, or really thinking about how the messaging external to the company is landing and getting that feedback and understanding how we may need to pivot from that. There's folks designated in the Office of Responsible AI to do that. Now with respect to the Aether Committee, which was established around the 2017 timeframe, really what that committee is made up of is senior leadership in various facets of the organization, from engineering, from human resources, or other parts throughout the parts of the company that really can coalesce and think about how does AI affect the products we build, the people we serve, and all those different things. And what they are essentially an advisory committee to our senior leadership to make sure that whatever's we are directions we're taking with respect to our products and services, we've always sort of considered the aspects of how the ethics of AI is really built into our products and services. And by doing so, they've established 7 working groups, and I can talk a little bit about those. And this sort of goes into what I mentioned before, as far as the use cases and the internal administration of how these things are sort of formulated. Really, the Aether Committee provides that advice to our senior executives to make sure we are landing things in the right way and building products in an ethical way. And those 7 working groups just really are really just meant to sort of evolve our journey. And one of probably the most important one in that case is the sensitive use cases working committee. So as we sort of are asked to partner with other companies or build certain issues, build certain services or whatever, in this day of COVID, maybe there's some AI deployments of contact tracing or what have you, to really think about where is Microsoft in that sort of supply chain, so to speak, of this technology. Are these sort of use cases in line, or do they sort of run afoul of our principles? So that's a little bit about how we've sort of thought about it. I mean, it's a moving target. As this technology and this area continues to evolve, we're going to need to evolve with it. So it's good to know that at least we have the infrastructure to sort of take advantage of that.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And I think also gives us a nice little transition actually to ask a question of Mike, because just listening to Alonzo talking about, projects potentially running afoul of their principles, and hearing Jeremy talk about some of these other kinds of principles that are out there. I mean, it really strikes me that one of the key questions in this domain of going beyond compliance in this data ethics space is how to take these broad principles and apply them in some kind of all things considered judgment, right? So you're faced with some question, you've got these broad principles, maybe you've even got all these really effective processes set up within the company for bringing people together to talk about these things. But there's still this question of, well, but like, what's the right judgment? Like taking all of these things into account, how do we actually weigh the principles so that, or not run afoul of those principles, again, to use Alonso's phrase. And I'm just wondering how you advise your clients who are trying to weigh this variety of factors when they're making responsible judgments.
Yeah, thanks, Piers, and thank you to the organizers in Ohio State for inviting me to participate in this really interesting discussion, an important discussion. You know, as I listen to Jeremy and Alonso talk about the other work that's been done, it strikes me that, and I've been aware of some of these initiatives, that this is really fantastic work and important work and invaluable in helping companies to incorporate ethical considerations in these day-to-day decisions they're making about products and services and other business activities. But as I'm working with individual companies, it becomes apparent very quickly that every company is different. They're different in terms of their size and their maturity and their resources. They're different in terms of the nature of the products and services that they're offering. They're different in the nature of the customers that and their users that they're supporting and their relationships with those users. And they're different in terms of the external societal impacts, the broader impacts that these products and services may have. And so, it's difficult to think about a one-size-fits-all approach. These companies need to think about how these kinds of ethical principles, these kinds of ethical considerations work for them, and which ones are key for their products or services. How can they incorporate those into their business? And a company like Microsoft that's done fantastic work, and the stuff that Alonso described is really, really great work. But the company like Microsoft has significant resources, right? It's got a culture of compliance and a long-standing and very mature approach to these issues. So they can invest in developing these frameworks and these ways of operationalizing those frameworks in meaningful ways. But not every company can do that. And so inevitably, a lot of the companies that I work with rely on less formal approaches. Sometimes it's just a gut feel. Does this feel right? Is this the right thing? And I, will sometimes step in and try to guide their thinking and talk about other considerations they should be asking, thinking about other questions they should be asking. First and foremost, and we've looked at this issue in the context of privacy for many, many years, is what are your user expectations? What are users expecting when they're coming in and engaging with you using your services? And have you done enough to shape those expectations? Does this advance or impede the kind of world you want to live in as a person, or that you want your children to live in? Think about broadly, what harms can what you're doing cause? Sometimes that is kind of worst case scenario thinking, and then you go from there. Sometimes it's just sort of thinking broadly, like how could this be misused? How could this result in harms that aren't intended, but maybe you can anticipate if you think about it. Another question I sometimes will ask them to sort of jog their thinking in this is just going through the simple exercise of drafting an externally facing privacy policy or other external representations, and pushing them to be transparent. Like, can you say more about this? Can you say more about what you're doing with data? Can you say more about who might access this? And if they start to go, oh, I'm uncomfortable saying that, and then I'm like, well, maybe you should reconsider, what you're doing, because at the end of the day, this stuff can get out. And what does that New York Times front page story look like? And is it something that you'll feel good about and you'll feel proud about? The other key thing I really try to push these companies to do is to bring in a broad set of perspectives. I can ask you these questions, And you might come up with some thoughts or ideas or considerations. But if I ask somebody else these questions, they might come up with a very different set of concerns or considerations. So, I say that's multidisciplinary. Don't just have a room full of lawyers. Bring in technologists, bring in economists, psychologists, ethicists if you can. And then other diverse perspectives, and that means gender, ethnicity, the LGBTQIA plus communities, religious minorities, different socioeconomic groups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The more perspectives you bring in, the more you're going to hear about potential harms that you may have not thought about. And so that's really key. And then the final thing that I will sometimes talk to clients about when they say, hey, you're the lawyer, I just want you to tell me what the law is. And I want you to tell me about my legal risk. We'll worry about this other stuff. And I'm like, ethics do affect legal risk. Ethics, the trust issues, the reputation issues, leading to bad New York Times stories issues, regulators read that stuff. You'll get on the radar of regulators. They'll start asking questions, plaintiffs' attorneys, et cetera. All of that kind of stuff that goes into trust and reputation can have legal risks. So I think it's to think about it narrowly, like, legal compliance is one domain and we shouldn't talk about ethics in that context, is a completely wrong way of thinking about this stuff. I'll stop there.
So there's already a lot that I would really like to dig into, but I want to bring Peter in on a specific point before we sort of open it up and get you all talking with each other more. I mean, Peter, one of the things that Mike mentioned was this reliance sometimes on kind of intuitive judgments or gut feel. And that is something in our study that we also saw. Not everyone, but plenty of companies that seem to be relying ultimately on some kind of gut judgment to weigh the various factors in order to sort of be able to make a decision about what they ought to be doing in this space. But my sense is that you've advised companies to adopt more of a risk management approach to these questions, and which sounds like a more structured approach. And I'm just wondering how it is that you go about recommending sort of responsible decision-making to them, if it differs from what Mike said.
Thanks, Pierce, and also thank you, Dennis, Tanya, for hosting this event and including me. I've been super curious about this area for a number of years, and I kind of tend to take the business perspective of this thing, and what I've observed is that well, we can kind of call it a risk management approach. In effect, what it is a decision-making approach. And what companies are struggling most with, against the backdrop that Mike and Jeremy and Alonso outlined, is that if they don't know how to make decisions, they actually don't move forward. I call it reticence risk. The absence of that decision-making ability ends up leaving value on the table because they just can't reconcile it. Mike said a really interesting thing about that every company is very different. What I think is probably core to that is that every company's profile, their risk profile, is very, very different for that. And so really the question is what's a sensible or an appropriate, culturally appropriate way to kind of help the company create a decision-making framework that allows them to reach a decision. And this kind of brings in this construct of risk, but really it's a balancing exercise. It says that, look, the only risk that's fully mitigated is if you don't take the risk. But that obviously then means that value, quite frankly, is left on the table. Value for the customers, value for shareholders, value for society. So it's really not an ideal state. So if we think about this from a risk management standpoint, what Alonso really identified is this daisy chain of things, is that ethics are really nice, but they really don't tell the software developer or the data scientist what's to do. So the way that organizations operationalize this is through setting up a series of translation into principles, into policies, into procedures. What I've kind of learned a lot about the AI space, and the governance of AI is very different than what I think we're experienced with in other governance areas. If you think about kind of the whole process of model development, technology selection, the distributed chain of AI, both in terms of data and technology, to then the deployment of it, and did it actually perform as intended, or does it perform over time? So this whole area of governance becomes much more complex and requires, I think, much more, I'll call it prescriptiveness, at least in terms of making it operational. A core part of this governance is what I call an impact assessment. You're starting to see a number of bills, a number of pieces of legislation that are advocating for AIAs, or algorithmic impact assessments, or AI impact assessments, whatever term is appropriate. But what they're really saying is that organizations need to take this kind of responsibility for assessing the impact of what they're doing, particularly in the world of algorithms. Well, if you think about kind of analyzing the impact of an algorithm, this gets into kind of what I'll call core decision-making, risk decision-making. You thought about, you want to identify the risks. You want to think about those things in terms of significance and likelihood. You actually want to think about the benefits, which is a kind of counter to the way that risk management thought about it, because obviously there are benefits. You want to think about the significance and likelihood of those. And then you want to overlay that against what controls you already have in place that mitigate that risk and capitalize on the benefits. And are there additional controls that you want to put in place? So what Mike really articulated is this informal process, is what I'll call the subliminal way in which we make that sort of decisions as a group of individuals. It's really just that process. What I've found in clients is doing it in a slightly more organized way. And I don't mean a formulaic way, but I mean in terms of organizing that discussion where you have that broad set of stakeholders or representatives that Mike talked about, where you actually really can peel apart the benefits, peel apart the risks, peel apart the controls. You end up in a qualitative way, or in an organized way, coming to a decision that matches that group around that table is feeling comfortable about. Are we doing the right thing? Have we thought about all the bad things that could go wrong? And have we done our best from a control standpoint to do about it? And if you then sort of extend that and say that for some organizations, translating that into a quantitative type of method is useful. But my experience with companies is that it only works if that organized qualitative process has gone through. But for some companies, particularly for those that have a very organized enterprise risk management process, building that quantitative version of the qualitative discussion and matching it into the ERM can be a super useful way about it. And you kind of just imagine this 5-point benefits, 2 likelihood, significance, risk, likelihood, significance, controls, simply translated into a benefit risk heat map. You end up having a representation of that qualitative discussion that everybody can say, I feel really, really good about the outcome. And now I can see it in a picture format of how to do it. So all it is really just an added tool to aid in that decision making. And let me kind of close with kind of where I think the real value of this organized decision making is in this ability to demonstrate it, not just internally. So if you think about kind of, Alonzo talked about kind of the senior leadership, my experience has been extremely useful to say, well, here's how we made the decision, here's how we analyzed it, here's the factors, and here's kind of what it looks like from a heat map standpoint. Now you've communicated internally to your executive leadership that, okay, I'm feeling, it's a way to kind of allow them to make an informed decision. But even externally, heaven forbid, if you're subject to either a bad press or a regulatory investigation, it becomes a demonstrable way to say, here's how we made the decision, and takes, I'll call the pressure that says, I don't agree with your decision, and puts it back more into the process standpoint. So let me stop there.
Thanks. That's really helpful. So let me first say to the audience that please do send in questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom call. And in about 10 minutes, we will be getting to audience questions. Also, okay, so where are we? There's so much on the table right now. Let me try to summarize just a few things. It seems like this whole field is partly about recognition that there is some convergence of strategic considerations and ethics. and that in order to be seen as a responsible company and get the trust of the public and customers and clients, you have to be a responsible player in this domain. And so it opens up the space to then think about, well, you know, we have to take ethics seriously. And then it seems like we're talking about at least three things, and that they're all going to need to be part of any complete kind of data ethics program. One is identifying specific harms that we might be worried about, or risks, ethical risks, things like, you know, bias and fairness and things like that. Trying to articulate some guiding principles that could be incorporated or, you know, internalized or operationalized in some way, but then also having some decision-making approach, right, that allows us to feel good about sort of the way we're taking those principles and those various considerations and actually having them yield a decision. Some of what I think on that last part, some of that is going to be about process, which we've heard a lot about already, and it's unavoidable because I think that's a natural way to try to solve some of these issues. Is should we be bringing in various stakeholders? Should some kind of IRB review? Should we have, you know, what kind of process might help us address this? But part of what I'm just really interested in there is like, what's the standard, right? If you bring together a bunch of stakeholders from various perspectives, what is it that they're trying to capture? And I'm going on a little bit, but let me just quote something Peter once said when he was being interviewed right as he was joining PwC, and I found this very nice quote from him online. He said, "It's not just understanding the current rules of the road and helping make them effective and efficient. It's at the same time evolving what the roadmap needs to look like. It's saying, I know what the legal requirements are, but what are the ethical requirements, the fair requirements of the marketplace?" And I think like we haven't yet put our finger on like, well, what is that standard of what the fair requirements of the marketplace are? Like, what is it that companies are trying to capture that maybe goes beyond just the expectations of clients or the public, or maybe it doesn't go beyond that at all. And I'm wondering if anybody would like to jump in on that.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I thank you for that reference to that quote. I've like everything, I've probably grown up a bit since then. I'm not sure that's the right problem to solve, to be really frank about it. And it's like, you know, ethics, if you think about ethics, they've taken hundreds of years, if not centuries, to evolve. They're often unspoken. So this is kind of why they're so important to get translated into describable principles. What will we do? What will we not do? I think that trying to set a standard around fairness in absolute terms, you know, has a problem. You know, what about the unintended consequences of something that we do that? And I just, you know, observed so many business decisions that I'm saying, well, we could do this, but wait a sec, we're actually thinking of this this particular application of this technology, this application of this data, and does that, you know, does that sort of strike kind of even perceptually a discord with what we might say there? And so in some respects, the principles of describing, you know, fairness or you know, non-discriminatory type stuff serve as kind of like a guideline. Principles are wonderful because they're descriptive, but you can drive a truck through them because they're really, really high level. But if you couple those with, well, how the heck did I make that fairness decision? You know, what were the internal policies and processes? You know, what was the decision-making process? Now you're having a discussion about how the decision was reached, as opposed to whether the decision itself was right. Absent of that, I'll call it structural type of approach, a company really can only defend, you know, I think it's wrong, I think it's right type of stuff. So it's almost an untenable type of decision. But if it's a describable process, then I think we can have a much different conversation, but also respect and acknowledge that these things are going to change. They're also culturally different. You know, I'm doing some work for some clients in China right now, and even the word human rights is thought about differently than it is in other parts of the world. That's not a judgment, but it's just fairness is a tough standard if you thought about it from a global standpoint. I think the process, though, is probably more defensible and culturally transferable.
Would anybody else like to jump in on that or on
Yeah,
anything else? Yeah.
I mean, when you talk about what is the standard for decision making, I mean, that's a really hard problem because we're dealing with oftentimes, new technologies, new business models for which, we as a society have not yet grappled with, and we haven't, figured out what the norms are. And that does take time. In the course of human history, sometimes that took decades or centuries, and now we're dealing with, if you take 6 months, everything's changed again. And so we're trying to anticipate harms in a bit of a vacuum. And I think, when Peter said something earlier in his opening remarks that I thought was really important, and that is, well, first of all, companies will get this wrong. Despite best intentions, people will get this wrong and they won't anticipate all the harms. But what Peter said something along the lines of, if there's an investigation or questions are raised, having done something where you can show that you went through a process to try to think about this, if you can show that you tried to be thoughtful about this, that you tried to anticipate the harms and you took steps to address or mitigate those harms, and nevertheless something happened that you didn't fully anticipate and something went sideways, that's a very different conversation than if if your motto is move fast and break stuff, because I think the expectation now and the standard is that you need to be thoughtful and you need to at least do your best to anticipate what the harms are and to do something to address this.
So it's more of a standard of being responsible, being accountable, and less about always getting it right.
Well, and being able to demonstrate that.
Jeremy or Alonzo, would you like to?
Yeah, I second everything that Peter and Mike said in that, and one of the things I was sort of reciting in myself, and particularly when Peter was giving his remarks, is that at the end of the day, the principles are the questions, right? The questions to ask. You know what I mean? They sort of give and right, and it's just a matter of the process is, hey, look, you need to ask the questions of the right people and need to have the framework in place to reach that sort of resolution. And I think it's somewhat about, as again, what Mike said, it's less about always getting it right, and it's more about doing it right. And that's what I look at it in terms of, hey, you've taken the process the way it should do it. You've taken advantage of you've asked the right questions. You've executed and demonstrated, to Peter's point, your process of reaching the decision. That is doing it right. You're always going to get it right. Absolutely no. As I said before, it's sort of a moving target. So there's always going to be something that you're not always going to hit right on the bullseye. So, but I again, second everything that Mike and Peter said.
Yeah, so Jeremy, I'm kind of coming back to you since you started us off and introduced these general principles. And clearly, I think people see them as valuable, at least for issue spotting or sometimes telling us things we shouldn't be doing, just stuff to take into consideration so that we can be thoughtful about what we're doing. But are you more optimistic about the idea that we could develop some kind of like a more of an ethical decision-making framework that wouldn't rely at some level on this kind of holistic judgment?
Yeah, I think we really are heading in that direction. And as others have stated, we're dealing with ethics here. So these are concepts that are beyond the law on the books. And, we do not have a comprehensive federal privacy law in this country. We have sectoral laws, we have the law in California, some action in some other states, but we don't have this law in place. However, so we don't know where are the gaps is sort of in how we're thinking about this. Though we don't have this law, there does seem to be a lot of agreement across industries, across political parties about, okay, what's important in terms of privacy and in terms of protecting consumers, protecting companies when it comes to privacy. So I think now we're at a point we've had a lot of these conversations about what should be maybe the black letter, which should be the law. So now it's a matter of, okay, we see that, and we have all of these ethical principles. How can we sort of marry these concepts together? So I think that that's a point where we getting it right. Yes, we are, necessarily not going to get it right every time, but yeah, I think it's about learning, and it's about maybe saying, okay, do we need to adjust the questions? As Alonzo said, these principles are often questions. What are we doing here with this data, with this technology? Do we need to adjust our questions? Do we need to adjust our answers? Do we need to maybe bring other folks into the conversation? So I feel like we have this sort of a lot of kind of baseline ideas that are being shared, and now it's a matter of kind of taking it to the next level and operationalizing these things.
That's great. So let me try to bring in some audience questions now. We've actually had a number of them that I think would love for us to talk about a specific example or two. So are there concrete examples from your work where you had to weigh various ethical dimensions? For instance, maybe a COVID related example, or another question asks about specific no-go zones. For instance, with regard to maybe facial recognition, right? Can one of you talk us through, or maybe more than one of you talk us through a specific case that you've faced?
Well, I think one example. It's often kind of interesting to see when things went wrong around that, and the proverbial. It's easy to play that Sunday evening quarterback, to borrow from a terrible sports analogy of that. But when things go wrong, it becomes pretty self-evident. Well, wait a sec. It seems like they really didn't do a threat analysis properly about all the possibilities of this. And the one example that I think is kind of striking today, and it's kind of COVID, but it's in the UK, one of the tests that all sort of secondary students take is their A levels, and it has a huge determination in terms of their what university they go to, or quite frankly, if they go to university. But they're in-person tests, which of course they couldn't do. So they used a statistical model to kind of say, well, what would the A-level results be for all of these kids? Seems like a practical solution to the problem. The reality was, though, that the training data that they used had some inherent biases put into it. So the net result was they undervalued. 40% of the population got lower scores than probably what it would, because of the way the data was done. And you could say that, well, wow, how did that possibly happen? And it seems that, again, with the benefit of sitting back, saying, well, wait a sec, if they had a process, even the informal one that Mike talked about, where you had a group of people that were relatively representative of all the things that could go wrong, started to say, well, have you thought about the fact that certain postal codes are if you're using that data as a determination of income, and therefore by extension academic stability, that's just not it's just not going to work out all that well. So that's the type of example you can say, well, wait a sec, how do we kind of learn from that example? How do we think about a process that works for our culture, for our company, for our risk profile, and try to be able to come up with a way that doesn't end up in the same sort of situation? So yeah, there's a lot of examples that kind of having sat through many of these decision-making process that ended up being different controls being put into play than perhaps weren't there before. But it's sometimes useful to look at the things that have gone wrong and say, but for the grace of God, this could be us.
Yeah, I would. One of the examples that came to mind, particularly when you mentioned facial recognition, is around. I think companies have a responsibility to also be honest where they are at in their sort of maturity of their own individual products and services. So for example, I mean, it's really circling back to something that Mike touched on earlier that I wanted to sort of double click on. It's really about the sort of inclusion and diversity of perspectives of people who are at the table, diversity and inclusion of the folks building products and services or responsible for, providing data, all those good things. So when in a facial recognition sort of standpoint, I know we've been public on various blog settings around, hey, look, we need to improve on identifying skin tones and getting it right. There's, the biases, the inherent biases of our technology that may be more accurate, in sort of identifying folks a particular skin tone or an age group or a gender or what have you. Those things need to be sort of, we need to be transparent about that. So that sort of informs the follow-on discussion of, I don't think we are prepared for our technology to be used in these contexts, because I do believe a lot of the times whenever that sort of go, no go decision is made or not made, it really it can't be made in a vacuum. There has to be a lot of context. And it's a collaborative effort with the folks that are ultimately looking to deploy and take advantage of the technology. What are the use cases? How are you thinking about that? And then it's a sort of an ongoing virtuous cycle of, say, hey, look, all right, you can release this in this setting, in this context, but the context changes, how you're using it. We get more data, more information, that there has to be sort of a lever to be able to pull that back if we feel like it's not the right thing to do at this time.
Yeah, and Alonzo, what you just said made me think of kind of a current example of some of these shifts. So virtual reality, which touches on AI. Right now, the audience for virtual reality is really the hardcore gamer audience, which skews young, it skews tech savvy, but we have seen a lot of efforts from a number of companies to expand this to a broader audience. And one of the communities that a lot of companies are really looking to adopt this technology is the older population, a population that maybe lacks mobility, where virtual reality could really be a great tool. But you have this, an older audience. There might be some different accessibility challenges that consumer base is most likely not as tech savvy. So a lot of these companies are starting to right now is quite niche, starts to go more mainstream or hit on different groups of consumers. How do we need to rethink this kind of before this technology makes this splash? What are the controls we can put in place? Now, concerns are going to emerge and these things are going to change, but that's like a shift that I've been seeing just from talking to a lot of folks, that sort of occurrence, because this technology is so emerging and is being continually integrated into different consumer bases.
I'll just add that the question asked about specific use cases, and I can't get into too many specifics because most of these conversations are privileged.
Right.
But and the question also asked about sort of no-go zones or the like. And I don't really think about no-go zones. I think about sort of high-risk zones. I mean, there's always positive use cases you can think of for any of these technologies, and then there's potentially some very serious harms that could take place. So with facial recognition, with anything involving kids, with using AI for decisions that affect fundamental rights or opportunities for people, any of those, it's like you selling to the government, whether it's law enforcement or other government agencies, thinking about the potential misuses of those technologies. All of those are higher risk. They warrant maybe taking a bigger step back and thinking awfully carefully about the potential harms and the mitigations. I wouldn't say any of them are no-go zones, but I would say many of them, warrant a heightened degree of scrutiny, a bit more, careful, thoughtful decision-making.
Great, thanks. We have just a couple of minutes, so I want to squeeze in just a very practical question we got, which is, do resources exist for small teams, nonprofits, or startups to facilitate these conversations and analyses when they don't have the resources to hire privacy counsel? What advice would you give to smaller outfits?
Yeah, this is where the process itself becomes super important, because it doesn't require a lot of resources. Think about it as just a facilitated discussion. So you know, you might have to invest to have somebody design the process for you. But then it can be relatively self-administered. Where it can get expensive and you kind of have to do about it is that if you're a small business, then you want to get the benefit of a kind of a broader range of views or some external advisory type of thing here. Then what often these companies will do is then invite select people into this type of stuff. I think we may see the creation of what I'll call for hire advisory type of boards. Think about it as a commercial IRB or a commercial ERB in European context. But I think it's pretty early days for that.
Yeah, and just in terms of just resources that are available for free today, a lot of that comes from academia. The work that Dennis and other folks at OSU are doing, I mean, I think everyone should check out that paper. Northeastern University has done a lot of work on this, and I think that can just give folks a place to kind of start. Here are the questions that others are asking. How does that map to our line of work? So there are a lot of those resources around, and I think I agree with Peter. I think we are going to see a movement of teams that can come in and perform this analysis of for hire. But right now, I would say look at sort of the landscape we have, and a lot of academia is looking at kind of specific questions.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning our report. We've just put the link to that report in the chat for anyone who's interested in it. And let me just say, I think we need to wrap up there. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of these issues, but it was a really interesting discussion. And so thank you, Jeremy Greenberg and Mike Hinsey and Peter Cullen and Alonzo Barber for joining us. I feel like there's going to be a lot to talk about in the coming years. Before we go, though, let me just tell the audience, remind them that this panel is part of a Business Data Ethics Month here at Ohio State. And besides clicking on our link for the report, there's also upcoming panels that we'd love for you to attend on October 12th, October 23rd, and also on the 29th. So the next one is really this upcoming Monday, which is very soon on October 12th, and that's going to focus on management approaches, processes that companies are setting up. So some of what we talked about today is going to be discussed in more depth on Monday, and we'd really love for all of you to join us for that one as well. So let me just say one last time, thank you to everybody, especially to the panelists for joining us. And sharing their wisdom, and also to everybody who was involved in putting it on, and to the sponsors. Thank you very much.